Well, good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, and beautiful afternoon it is too. Another grand spring day in Virginia. Just lovely. My great pleasure today to introduce our speaker, Dr. Jennifer Fish, who's chair of the Women's Studies Department and has been doing some really terrific work in community engagement with students, particularly in Southern Africa, in South Africa and Rwanda, and no doubt will be spreading to other areas. I wouldn't be a bit surprised. The whole concept of community engagement, of course, is one that is of interest to the university. It's part of our strategic plan. Community engagement, not just in overseas countries, but also, of course, closer to home. But having our students, that give them that extra experience of being in another country, working either as a study abroad program, of the kind that Dr. Fish has led, or in some other capacity that will really make a difference. So they come back to the university, not only they learned something about the country that they were in, but they've left something behind of value, and that, I think, is the really critical part. So I'm really looking forward to today's conversation with Dr. Fish about how she encourages students to be involved in the community.
Okay, I'm good. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Simpson. Thank you for being here on this beautiful day. I know we always pause at this time of year as we're finishing the semester to think about our summers and how we might reinvigorate our teaching. And so I'm here to encourage you to consider service learning, whether you take students overseas or you're looking to transform your own education by building in more of the community ties, which is part of our strategic plan. I have a folder for you so you can take a few bits of homework home. And I will take you vicariously on some of my adventures with students, which have been so transformative to me as a scholar, as a researcher, and as an educator. So thank you so much for being here. Let me just say that I have taken photos, and I have, to the best of my ability, approval to use these photos. So this PowerPoint will be available online. And I just thought I'd start today by telling you how I got involved in service learning. My sixth grade teacher gave us a chance, 4 students a chance, to drive with him from Ohio all the way to San Diego, California, and back again over the course of 3 weeks. And he said, you must pay attention, you must keep a journal, and you must write about what you experience. And this was a pretty grand adventure for a 12-year-old girl from Ohio who had traveled to Michigan for her summers. So I always feel as though when I talk about outreach education, experiential education, I have to thank Dr. Breen back in the early 80s. So let me talk about my standpoint, as we say in women's studies. I come to this having led service learning courses for 6 years internationally, and I also work as an activist scholar activist, which means that I see my research as part of contributing to a wider movement towards social justice, which is very core to my field in women's studies and in sociology, where we have been looking to communities to inform our research and to build important ties. And so as a scholar, I look at gender, I look at social development, social reconstruction, and so as I'm out in the field, this is part of my research, and I wanted to begin by demystifying the idea that community engagement and service learning is about global do-gooders and taking students into service volunteer opportunities. It's really quite critically linked to research and long-term educational pursuits. Jane Addams said we must have 1 foot in the library and 1 foot on the streets at all times, and I try to uphold that in my work. So it's interesting to look at this in this particular era because, of course, President Obama has put a call out for universities and national public institutions to be part of a greater community engagement, public discourse dialogue. And one of the challenges facing universities is that we're wondering how much we are to do the community justice engagement and how much that steps outside of the traditional roles of scholarship, which is based at a university and focuses upon learning itself. And of course, as I'm thinking about the QEP as well, one of the greater dimensions is how do we measure service learning when we're taking students outside of the traditional boundaries of the classroom. So those are some of the larger issues at hand there. This is my student reaching the top of Table Mountain, Tara Burke, and these are students at the University of Cape Town. So we've engaged in this kind of learning all over the continent, and certainly the idea of being out in nature is part of the experience. I'll just give you a brief overview of the educational philosophies behind this, and you have more resources in your packet. So in the 30s, John Dewey came out and said education is about experience, and we must have a reflective process, and education must be social, must be interactive, and experiential. And that experiential element is the core of service learning, which carries us through the work that we do, whether we're in local or global contexts. In the 70s, the most widely referenced educational model that builds service learning programs is that of David Kolb. And he says that the concrete experience forms the foundation of the educational philosophy. And so students can engage in this model at any point. We tend to think of academe as the ivory tower as we start with abstract conceptualization. We start with theories. And in fact, in this model, students may engage at any point, and the key is to build in the educational process reflective capacities. So students reflect upon their experience, and then of course they see theory differently if they have lived experience. So there's a great focus on the individual experience and students' ability to connect the micro with the macro, the lived experience with the broad abstract philosophies and theories. And I'll just talk about some fundamental concepts. There's a wealth of literature. There are 3 national organizations on community service and community justice initiatives within higher education. 1 is focused on international, and all of those are in your resource packet. So let me just overview some of the key components you'll find when you delve into these mission statements. So the first idea is that there's reciprocity, and that we are not sending students out in the world to work for the poor or the vulnerable or the marginalized. They're working with. And ideally, the most successful programs have a co-collaborative, co-learning foundation. And that means that as educators, we need to go out into the world and figure out what's most valuable to organizations, rather than designing some kind of learning experience and dropping that into an organization, which sets up a certain kind of differential in terms of power. Okay, so there's a reflection process throughout. So the critical part is that students in their academic component reflect upon the service, and they bring that lived experience back into the classroom. And some would say that lived experience is a replacement for a text. The lived experience becomes one of the texts. And then, of course, there's a great focus on the process and the development of relationships. And some of the most important service learning work we've seen is in the establishment of long-term working relationships. I do have to nod to those critics. There are many out there, and some say that the role of universities is not to be a global do-gooder, and some acknowledge that there is a clear global divide in terms of those who have resources to do the global do-gooding. And I love this quote here, saying that also students, while they're out in the world, get a nice line on their resume, they get travel tales, and they get to tell the stories of being out and about in the world for very short-term focused periods, and we need to acknowledge that. And many organizations, particularly in the developing world where I work, say it takes a lot of capacity to be able to receive a U.S. student. And as educators, we really need to work on being that liaison and developing long-term relationships. Otherwise, service learning can add a whole other dimension of expectation to community organizations. We work in Rwanda, and I'm always referencing the summers I've spent in Rwanda. I now see high school students working and running around public health institutions in Rwanda so that they can have better applications for their university, high-level university selection processes. So we need to be very careful about the extent to which students are really trained to go into particular kinds of organizations and situations. I also wanted to say that I welcome your inquiry. I'm going to show you some examples, but if you have questions throughout, or if something doesn't make sense, feel free to raise your hand. So there are many kinds of service learning and community engagement educational models, and we talk most often about service learning in the classroom and also about study abroad kinds of immersion opportunities. But we can also think about student employment, internships. We have federal work-study programs that are committed to community justice, and we can even think about mentoring, one-on-one types of experiences that get students out into the world. These are my students last year in South Africa, just about to part. Patrick Green works at Roosevelt University, and he developed an umbrella of experiential learning. And what we're learning in the QEP process is that we're thinking about scaffolding experiences in terms of assessment and how we can evaluate students at each step in the process. So this is not to suggest that one kind of service learning is necessarily better than another, but it is to recognize that students can build upon volunteerism as a base, where they may go out into community for a short time period and then eventually work into community-based research. And we've had students build dissertations and theses based upon the research they're doing. So we want to think of it as a scaffolding process. And I just wanted to recognize, too, that service learning, again, the core principle is that it is linked to a classroom experience and that there's evaluation based on the academic learning. So the lived experience becomes a text, and students bring that back to the classroom, and students' individual experiences become a part of the classroom conversation. And service learning is not about going out and volunteering as a separate entity to one's education. So the critical part is that integration throughout. Learning outcomes. What we do know from the research is that students are transformed because of service learning. We know that it develops their career skills. We know that it develops a certain sense of self. And I want to believe that it also develops an aesthetic appreciation for the world, a role as a global traveler, and we don't have research on that yet. There are these other dimensions of taking students into the so-called real world that have not yet been measured in the literature. So I want to work on adding to these as they exist. But we can see that it's also very important to universities, because students who have these transformative educational experiences go out into the world and they come back as stronger alumni and stronger advocates for the university. And in some cases this increases our development efforts, and we know that students are satisfied and they may link their experiences to these transformative encounters as they go out into the world. So it's important to look at it as an institution. We've had students change their career direction, of course, by going through service learning and being introduced to the multiple forms of work in a particular sector. Personal outcomes, we can look at how individuals are transformed. Obviously, we look at their leadership skills, their communication skills, their ability to work in a very complex situation and expand that into the academic field of inquiry where they place themselves. But we also look at social outcomes, and we see that students who go out into the world, who participate hands-on in a clinic where the clinic facilities struggle to have access to light because of electricity shortages. I've worked with students in these kinds of situations, and we see that their awareness about global inequality transformed. They have had cross-cultural immersion experiences that I believe foster peace-building, citizenship skills, diversity appreciation, and larger qualities that we hope our graduates develop and that they individually contribute to as a larger social change movement. I also wanted to emphasize that, again, social responsibility and service learning comes out of this core connection between the experience of service learning and the research that students conduct. And I was looking back through my photos, and I saw my students here on the right with Dr. Alberta Mayberry, who's the U.S. Consular General to South Africa, and she graciously gave us a half a day at the U.S. Consul General to talk about careers in diplomacy that day. And I looked at the group of students and I realized every one of them from this most recent trip has gone on to develop a project back in the United States, develop a dissertation topic, of which there's one student in the room here, or to develop some kind of graduate research paper. And as a scholar, we're also able, as faculty members, to link that to our own research. So, for example, I've been looking at domestic workers in South Africa for 10 years. My colleague here has decided to develop her dissertation on that topic, and we've also had students that have gone on to do co-publications. We have 2 major pieces of writing coming out right now. And so there's a real vital opportunity as faculty to increase our research productivity by working with students in a service learning capacity. We also see this growth in public disciplines. So we've seen there's a public philosophy organization. We see Education Without Borders, Engineers Without Borders, public sociology. So there are these major fields within, major movements within the fields that have been traditionally defined as academic disciplines. Let me talk to you a little bit about international service learning. I do believe this global dimension adds a depth to the experience, certainly adds another level of personal resilience that's required among students. And then imagine taking students from a classroom, normally groups of 10 to 20 students, into settings like this where they're buying their daily supplies in the market and they're having to survive one-on-one, and they're having to learn about group dynamics because they're in the process of intense group experience while they're there and while they're challenged on all sorts of levels. So individually, they're there often without cell phones, without Facebook, without connectivity, and it's these micro dimensions that tend to elevate the learning experience in ways that are unpredictable. We go in and design day-to-day experiences, itineraries that connect to a greater lesson plan for the day and a field, and it's in these moments when students sometimes have their greatest awakenings and their greatest moments of change we talk about institutional change. Of course, we're focused on building international partnerships. We do that with universities and also with community-based organizations. And we've been able to ideally send students outside of the borders of the U.S. and also bring individuals back to this institution. That's the larger hope. And again, as I mentioned, the hope is that students continue these ties into their longer-term work as advocates for social justice. And even in those micro-encounters, they're building peaceful relationships. Just let you read that for a moment. Working in the field of international education, it's been interesting to note that there is this clear focus in the U.S. on the products of our students and their performance in an international context. So the idea is that the reason that they go often on international immersion experiences is to be better equipped, to have better communication skills, to be more desirable to employers. And so there's a kind of outcome-based product here that is about creating a global citizen product that will then be more attractive on an international market in terms of job seeking. So I thought this quote was interesting because it says, in essence, we have to diversify and understand that the world is not knit together, and understanding these differences then creates a different kind of university product. And so when we link the fields of service learning and international education, there's some interesting dialogues there in terms of the products it creates and why students go about it. I'll move into my own experiences and tell you about what some of our students are doing here at ODU. It's an enthusiastic experience for me to take part, and some of our students are here to reflect on their time. I wanted to tell you about an organization which began our work. So I've been taking students to South Africa since 2006, and we work with an organization called Education Without Borders. It's based in Vancouver, Canada, and we take undergraduate students into high school settings in very under-resourced situations in the so-called townships of South Africa. And there we see that high school students and university students often have a 3 to 4 year age gap, and our undergraduate students can feel connected and empowered, and they often find easy ways in which they can contribute to a high school setting. So in developing this international program, I had to think about the range of students who would be traveling with me, and then the kinds of educational experiences that I could set up. In my own case, I've been working in South Africa since 1995, going there on an annual basis and living there for nearly 3 years of my life. And so what's made it work for me is that I go back to the same organizations and I build the relationships each time, and I know the organizations well enough that I can partner students with the needs within the organizations. It's not always fluid, and it does change because a lot of the organization's staff members turn over from year to year. But in my case, it's very important to go back and revisit the organizational sites every year to make this work. So this has been a very viable partnership, and it's interesting because it's a link then that students carry back to North America because they know this organization, Education Without Borders. So while we were there, this is an unexpected student learning opportunity. Initially, Education Without Borders focused on infrastructure development within under-resourced schools. And one of my students in 2008 took this photo, and she was very moved by this photo because it was in the back of the high school, and a lot of the students there don't have desks. And so she said, how can this be that high school students in a public education system in South Africa, where we had this transformation, how can it be that they don't have school desks, and there are all these desks in disrepair in the back of the school? So she took that photo, and then with her open heart, she came back to the United States and sold Krispy Kreme donuts for a year, and she saved enough money to fund a resource center for this school. And so she bought the tables and the chairs, and she worked with the music instructor there and the principal. And so this was the physical space transformation. And this is very powerful for students because, of course, they could grasp the tangible outcome of their work, and they could show what they had done. But what happened, though, as we went through this process is that we realized that for students it wasn't just about having a space where they could do math tutoring and peer support group after school, that the students actually said, you know, this is the only place where I feel safe. I'm in after-school programs because in my community I'm at risk if I stay after school, or when the sun goes down there are so many vulnerabilities for students that this space became a very symbolic space. It wasn't just that the donuts supported the chairs and the desks. And when students really got that, and again, that wasn't so clear to me, I got that from working so closely with students, what simply building a space within a school meant in a township in South Africa. So that project continues. We've also developed an organizational tie with Grandmothers Against Poverty and AIDS, and I talk about this today because this is a group of grandmothers, all of whom have lost their own daughters and sons to the HIV/AIDS pandemic, and all of whom are caring for grandchildren in a way that they did not expect in their elder years. And so this is a group of 300 grandmothers who come together. They do HIV/AIDS awareness education, community outreach, sex education, and emotional support groups and income generation for grandmothers, most of whom have lived through the apartheid era and are now working in a very under-resourced part of South Africa. Well, when I first went to Grandmothers Against Poverty and AIDS in 2005, they had a building and they had about 6 members who came to the organization every day, but they really weren't in a place where they could receive volunteers. They didn't have anyone who could translate in English. They didn't have any idea of what students could do, so they welcomed the idea of a gift, but they didn't quite know how we could develop this as an educational partnership. So over the course of going back over the years and seeing the organization grow there, we eventually worked to have students document life stories, and this is of course in partnership with grandmother leaders within the organization and translators. And we worked with a photographer who documented South Africa's struggle of apartheid, and we captured grandmother stories through photographs and through narratives. And so this year, because I had one student go back 2 years to South Africa, we funded this opening of an exhibition which documented grandmothers' lives and also provided a gallery space for individuals to experience the narratives of women's stories there. And the hope is that we will bring that exhibition here to the United States. And so this won a U.S. Ambassador's grant based on the work of the students and that linkage that showed a certain international partnership that fostered the U.S. investment in this particular organization. And of course it highlights a very, very important cause. When we look at HIV/AIDS, most people don't think about the critical dimensions of elder women there. So that's one of the great success stories. And again, that involves students working in between year to year to raise funds to do that. I mentioned again my own work with domestic workers, and we have a filmmaker here. One of my students worked over the course of a year and documented our story, and Robin and Rachel actually made a film about students' experiences going to South Africa and then coming back and re-entering. And we don't know a lot about what happens in terms of assessment when students come back. So this film chronicles the story of the students who went there, but also what happened to them when they came back, beginning when they had landed in the Atlanta airport. So I have some copies here. I'd be happy to loan those to you. I'll just pass that around. Then also, I wanted to mention this organization, beloved BEADWORK, because as a faculty member, when students have particular interests, the University Study Abroad program is wide open. So we tend to draw a lot of students from women's studies because that's the disciplinary home of this course, sociology, education, and international studies. But then we get students who have an interest in business or microenterprise. And so as a faculty member, I've been stretched in terms of looking to create enriching experiences for students. And this has been one because this is a business. It's a small, fair trade-based business, and it's for profit. And the women who make the products in this organization come predominantly from regions of conflict in sub-Saharan Africa, although that story is not told in the production of the products. And so we've had students work there, and now we have an initiative to bring those products here, and again, another way for students to get involved. So the idea is that the experience is not in isolation, that they go to South Africa or any part of the world and they leave the experience there, but ideally they bring something back and there's a project that comes out of the connection. And this has been another vital example. And to be quite honest, it's a way for others to engage in the work because they can buy a product and look at an example of service learning and feel as though they're engaging to a certain extent in this broader movement toward social responsibility and education. We have one site which is a delicate one, and we train students to go to work in sites that deal with sexual violence in South Africa. And I wanted to mention this one because there are sensitivities and there are liabilities. And so in sites like this, we select students who have training on this side and who are fully prepared. And there's a lot of emotional work that goes into the kinds of experiences that students witness. I've worked in hospitals with students. I've had students witness women delivering babies without proper resources. And so it's important to recognize that we have to be careful in sending students out. And as faculty members, we're not there with students all the time, holding their hands. So we have to be really conscious of what happens in their day-to-day experience as they're moving through these immersive service learning encounters. I'll talk a little bit about the skill sets. So you want to think about sites, organizational sites, and then the skill sets that students acquire. This is a student from 2005, Emma Maestrich, and she now works at a National AIDS Foundation in Washington, D.C. She was with me as a senior student in a former institution, and she was documenting the stories of individuals who chose to wear this HIV/AIDS t-shirt. And so she was wanting to be a journalist and to record life stories at this time. And I remember walking with her in this community, and the electricity lines were on the ground. And so the community leader said, be careful because we've just had a problem with the electricity. And so this was kind of an intense moment, and she was working to understand why people were wearing these HIV t-shirts if they weren't really HIV positive. And so she was out there, and then it's been so enriching because, of course, as a faculty member, we build close relationships with students when you travel with them and live with them and eat with them over the course of 21 days. One gets to know one's students well, and that develops long-term ties. And we hope that that connects to students' feelings of connection to the university. And so I always appreciate seeing what students have done after we've had these immersion encounters in the field. This is Noel Robb, who was one of the founders of the Black Sash, which is a movement to challenge apartheid under the former system in South Africa. She's since passed on. And one of our students, Corey Nixon, who's at Arizona State University now in a doctoral program, created persona poetry based upon the stories of 10 South African women leaders. Linda Fortune was another one. And so now we have this poem and this narrative of Noel Robb's life, which is very, very powerful. And Corey's work, she has a collection of poems which she could publish in the future. So there's room for the creative arts. Sherry, you can send students our way. Photography has been another link. Obviously, students are very savvy with connection and technology and use of film and flip cameras, and so they like to go out and document. And I've been working on trying to encourage students to document in a systematic way and in a way that builds some kind of educational model. And we earned a teaching technology grant to allow students to create mini experiences which would then be fed back into university classrooms. So again, it's about expanding the knowledge so that it's not just students who get to go on these courses that understand the importance of the international work. I mentioned the film as another product of our course. And then I wanted to talk a little bit about pedagogy, and I think I'll leave this to you in terms of how you may adapt this in your own courses. But there are some dimensions to the pedagogical structure that are consistent throughout. So students learn through reflection, and what I've done in my courses is to, whether it's in the United States or abroad, to develop an experience for students and to have them bring that experience back to the group and dialogue so that the 10 students' experiences come back. And what we find is that there are vital connections between healthcare, education, sexual violence, so all the themes of the course come together in that dialogue process. So if students are in a course at the university, it's important to build time into your classroom to build the reflective piece within. And of course there's wonderful interdisciplinary knowledge base because students build from a number of different fields, and we learn the process of critical inquiry. I also wanted to mention that it's sometimes in the everyday encounters when we're out in the field that students have these moments of awakening. And I can recall taking many students inside of the homes of friends in parts of the world that would have homes that look very different to their own here. And I remember times when students couldn't understand why I was taking 45 minutes to go through the greetings. And at times it took that long to boil the water for tea. And one always has tea when one welcomes someone into the home. And so just having students sit there in a home, in a very small living room, and wait for tea is something I wouldn't plan in the syllabus, but these encounters really transform student learning. This is another example. We worked in a rural community in East Africa, and we were walking through the field. We were on a community walk, which is a pedagogical technique in social development where you ask community members to take you on a walk through their experience, through their eyes kind of experience. And we walked upon a funeral. And so we just tried to do as best we could politely observe the funeral, but just to be there and be in the experience of this community funeral in a very rural area of Africa was a moment that was quite transformative, and we grasped from that so many other dimensions of the context that, again, were unplanned. I've had students do some wonderful work as well with reflection and writing, and this is a student who's very inclined in the arts, and so I ask students while they're in the field to keep a journal. And I encourage students in an international context not to use their computers to actually write and do some reflective work, which is usually a stretch, particularly as students are now socialized with texting and Facebook technology. But this is an example of one student journal, and I'm cautious about how I use those journals. I don't read them all word for word because I want students to have a chance to write about their challenges, and there are challenging moments in the process. But having them pause and write, and also having them write while they're in the field and things aren't going as they're supposed to be, develops a certain kind of life flexibility, one would hope. So looking back on those, there's a documentation process and a free-flowing writing process that's been very valuable in the teaching. And then I wanted to share with you what I found was that students often went into the field with me in South Africa and they said, well, we want to look at apartheid and democracy transformations, and we're interested in how women are doing so well in South Africa. So they had done most of their reading and they had gone in with ideas. But what happened later on is that they said, well, we don't want to talk about race in our group. We're here in South Africa. We had racial difference within our group. And this played out in terms of how we were received, what assumptions were made while we were in country. And so it took some work year after year to say to students, what matters is that we do our own work here, not just that we study South Africa, because there are such vital interconnections. So when we're doing international work, it's important to look at the dimensions of looking onto the other that free us from looking at ourselves. And that's been a very important part of the group work and the individual process of leading these kinds of experiences for students. I have many resources for you here, but I'll just give you some ideas about how to go about service learning, and then I'd love to have a dialogue with you, just to let you know that you don't have to develop an international course. You can begin in small ways, and you can ask students to go out in the field, have that experience, use that experience as one text, and bring that back into the classroom. And you create an experience that's connected to your course theme in some way. You can also have students prepare as a group a presentation for a community-based organization, and then at the end of the course the students go and present. They build a connection, but it's not in a week-to-week capacity where you're measuring 2 hours at a time. You can also have students develop a product, and we've had some very interesting research models based on student work. And they can also collaborate and work on participation models with faculty and go out and do assessment work with faculty. And here there are vital opportunities in working with graduate students as well, of course. So again, to emphasize, the lived experience is text, and you have students go out in the world and then you ask the vital question, what happened, so what, and now what do you do about that? But again, the transformation is in using the lived experience as a text and getting students to say, of what is this an instance? James Rosenau, a globalization theorist, often taught by saying, you're seeing this encounter, but of what is this an instance? So when you can teach students to take the micro and elucidate what's happening in the larger sphere, that can be the vital, critical moment, we hope, in the learning process. We're working right now on documentation, and I'm working with the International Programs Office, and Steve Bell is developing some outcomes assessments because we don't actually know how this happens. So students finish their course evaluations, we ask them how it went, and we generally get responses that mirror the student survey responses in courses that are traditional in form. And so what we're trying to work on is, well, how do we measure these kinds of transformations? How do we know what happens to students in the field when they've had these encounters? We don't know about language acquisition, appreciation of global diversity. These other dimensions are very difficult to quantify. But obviously the core practice is an academic rigor rather than volunteer service alone. And the academic credit is for the learning, not for the service, not for simply going out into the world and working. Okay, and then these are some tools for how to assess community learning. And I wanted to say here institutionally that it does require that faculty invest time in going into organizations, determining the needs, and then finding ways for students to be the conduit there. So that's an important part to think of in terms of building an institutional movement. I'll lastly leave you with one kind of peak moment teaching experience, certainly in my career. So the literature suggests that the most ideal kind of community service-based model would be one that links themes internationally and locally. And so as a result of the work that our colleague Von Frederick began in women's studies, we developed a course here on refugee studies. And the course asked students to work with our Hampton Refugee and Immigration Services organization. And what the students did here was that they developed a college transition workshop. So they worked with newly relocated communities, and they helped them fill out financial aid forms, get through the admissions process, work on language, work on essay development. And they taught the skills of how to apply for college applications. And so from that course, then we started to look at the literature and we developed a theme. And then I had the great fortune, the support of the Provost's office, to take students to Rwanda, and we encountered refugee situations there, and we went on a 3-week investigation, and we also partnered with organizations. So I took 2 of the students who'd been formative in this local course to Rwanda, and we worked at a UN refugee camp which housed 19,000 people who had been living there for 16 years. And it was the first time I'd been to such an environment myself. And so we got to see these vital linkages between the local and the global. These are the students who went with me. We were on another community walk, and we walked into this elementary school. And the teacher there in the red shirt taught in 3 languages. She was from the refugee camp herself, and she was working with about 50 kids in this little classroom. And my students continually point back to that moment as the pinnacle experience in this course. Then I took those same 2 students to South Africa, and they worked with an organization in South Africa that was about the Agency for Refugee Education Services, Training, and Advocacy. So this was an educationally based organization with a parallel function in South Africa. And what they determined was that the situation for refugees in Rwanda, in that refugee camp, was actually better than in South Africa, a much more developed part of the world. And so out of that, we're developing 2 research papers, and the students have, that's the dream teaching experience. They've been able to move into all these different dimensions of the work. And I'll just share briefly a little bit about this research project that we took part in. Students, when they got to the agency, they said, "You're researchers, you're graduate students, we want you to document what's happening." And we noticed that a lot of women are bringing their children into South Africa, and they believe their children will have citizenship rights if they're born here, but they will not. And so my students had to go out and survey 50 women who were carrying children who looked to be pregnant in this center, which had about 800 people that day, and asked them if they believed their child would have citizenship rights or not. And this was a pretty intense experience for our students. And I'll just give you one example of what one student said in terms of that disorienting experience and what she gained from it. So our students went into a processing center where individuals from all over sub-Saharan Africa were trying to get into South Africa, and this is the country with the largest amount of refugee inflow in the world. And she had to experience this, and she also realized that some of the people who had been waiting for access to citizenship rights had been waiting at this center for days and weeks. And so, of course, this was a transformative moment, but it took a lot to distance from that experience and then turn that into a research, and then out of that we have this survey. So I just wanted to acknowledge that the emotional and the intellectual and the scholarly process work together here. I have for you these resources. I have 2 other examples of students and their narratives, so I've been working toward collecting them, but in the interest of time, I'm just going to work through these. Students talked about the hope they felt in these settings. And then the other key is working with international partnerships, which has allowed for continuity and long-term sustainability. This is some of our work with the Red Cross in Rwanda. So let me just leave you with some institutional considerations. So you see the potential in terms of our mission, our strategic plan. Obviously, some intense transformative learning opportunities come out of these experiences. I mentioned the importance of alumni loyalty and connection to the university. And then we also know in the higher education literature that we spend a lot of time orienting students to universities, but we don't do a lot when they leave. And so oftentimes these experiences are senior year, and they're transitional experiences that move students into their professional lives or further graduate school. Some challenges. Obviously, it requires structural support, institutional commitment, more time, more resources. Measurement is a challenge. We're still not clear on the best practices there. And then I also wanted to mention that there is a feminization of service and who does service for the university and who does service learning work. And the field is not so disproportionately feminine when we go to international conferences and national organizations, but this kind of work is not measured in tenure processes, and it's often not valued, and we still see a divide in terms of that which is considered rigorous scholarship and that which is softer so-called service service learning scholarships. So as a feminist scholar, that's always of consideration to me, and I wanted to put that out into the dialogue today. And then, of course, we want to think about, are we requiring students to do service? Are we requiring volunteer work in courses? And that might not always be feasible given the larger dimension, particularly in larger courses. I'll just point to benchmark institution, Roosevelt University in Chicago has social justice as a mission, and what they say is that service learning is the component that links to the retention policy and links the curricular and the co-curricular and bridges the university with the community. And so that's an important example of building service learning, community engagement, and community-based research into a wider institutional mission. So I'll leave you with an important visual there, back to the elementary classroom, John Dewey's words. Thank you for your time. I'd be happy to talk with you about techniques, and I would love to see a faculty initiative to link those of us who are interested in this kind of work. We have the Office of Student Engagement here at ODU, and they have a part-time initiative on this kind of work, but I'd love to see a wider faculty connection here. So thank you for your time.
Sorry, I didn't see you.
I want to develop community service component as a part of my lab for undergraduate 400 students, environmental sciences, which is a perfect topic for community service learning.
Right.
But just the logistic of it what holds me back. Because dealing with 400 students and trying to arrange it all kinds of different organizations that would be interested potentially in participating, having volunteers and things like that. So I want to know what kind of support can I get on campus that can help me with this logistic paperwork, liability issues, volunteers, flyers, things like that. That's why I actually came to this talk. That's what I want to know. Because I'm already sold. I don't need to be, sell on this idea how beneficial that is. I know that already. I just want to know what we can get on campus to help us develop this as part of our curriculum. So I don't know who this question is for, provost office or for you. I don't, because you have experience, I guess, yourself.
I can start with, we do have an office in SEAS which helps in terms of community service, and I'll give you my card, and if you send me an email, I will make the connections for you.
Okay.
So we do have some support. It may not be enough, but we could start with that.
Right, and we can expand it, right?
Right.
Eventually, if
Yes.
we have more and more initiatives
Yes.
on campus, you will be...
Yeah. We actually have an office that deals with community service engagement, and they will work with you.
That's great.
It's also a numbers capacity issue, though, too. I mean, 400 undergraduates, is it?
Yes.
That's quite a lot. I mean, you have that responsibility of being the liaison. So perhaps you can develop a very structured, very accessible kind of experience where the students go out and observe in a place that may be publicly open. And so perhaps the community link there would be to take a select group of students and present back to an organization. But that number is quite a lot. I mean, we should recognize that it is much easier in classrooms of 12 to 18. I mean, that's kind of the ideal model. But there are ways to do it. And in your resource package there are some sample syllabi in environmental science, natural science, engineering. So there are many models in the field. And I'd be happy to talk with you further. Hi, Martha.
Hi, Jennifer. Thanks so much. I am thinking a lot about language, and I'm wondering if there's some way to connect with, say, nursing or public service or something like that. There's a lot of, I think there's a need for students to be able to speak, as translators and stuff. But you said something about them being prepared, and I just don't know, how do we go about getting our students prepared enough to be able to step into a house like these students are dealing with very sensitive issues, right? And so how do you get your students prepared enough to be able to, say, go into a house where someone doesn't speak English very well and they're dealing with medical issues? I mean, so how do we start getting our students sort of prepared to be able to do things like that? I mean, they have the language ability, but how do we train them on the sensitivity issues?
Well, your question brings up another important question, Martha, because we have to acknowledge that for students, this is a great investment, and particularly for students who may be first generation, there's a resource dimension, and that's another critique of the global do-gooders, right? So students pay to have these kinds of experiences. So ideally, in terms of a course design, I would suggest a preparatory course, a 3 credit hour course where you build the skills, and then the next 3 credit hour course where you go in field. And that hasn't been possible because then that requires a 6-hour commitment for students. So we end up doing intensive teaching in the orientation side. In fact, I'm taking 18 students to Senegal in a month, and we just talked about how to respect the elders when you enter a room, never look in the kitchen, never open the refrigerator, because our reputations are on the line to a certain extent based on how students perform and act and what they do in country. So we do invest quite a lot on the front end of that, and of course there are great payoffs, but at the moment that's not built into a curriculum. Now there are schools that have greater resource bases from students and institutionally, and they will build that in. Some schools say you must have 3 experiential learning activities as you graduate. You check them off just like you would the writing exam. There you have 3 immersion experiences, and then with that, when you have an institutional model, of course, then you have the ease of requiring a course as a preparatory course. And then I'll just say too, in the medical side, that's a whole other dimension, so that requires a supervisor on site, and ideally that expert as a faculty leader. So that's a very important boundary to honor in terms of the capacity of students, especially in relation to liability, of course. And we need to be careful that we're not using the third world, to the so-called global south, to be an experiment development site for students. I'm very conscious of that too.
The questions? There we go.
I try to create a sense of community in the classroom, very first thing, not a PowerPoint, not a syllabus, but creating interactive mingling and getting to know each other. And then I'm trying very hard they're all from Norfolk, so let's see, how would you? So I try very hard to let them know what's going on in this community so that they can practice their English to chat with people, not rush and on this cell phone business, but anyway, so the libraries have free events, barber shops. I say, talk with the barber. You have 15 minutes to relax, listen to him, learn a little English, say how wonderful, they'll go on talking. And any situation, farmers market, they love markets. I have people who've been here 3 months, many simple workers, Latinos, other rich NATO spouses. It's interesting because we have a mingling of classes. But the sense of community, some of them work so hard, but if they can get out a little and just in a calm way, not rushed in Walmart, but in certain places where they can really practice and listen to English in the community. Like if you go to Taco Bell or I don't know where, or Walmart, everything is rush, 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 cell phones. This is a very fast society. And Latinos in the tiendas over here, they love to talk. It's slow moving in the tiendas. Everybody passes by. And anyway, this community is right here in Norfolk. Thank you so much. I'll try to read more of your research.
Thank you. We have students working in English language training provides that connection so bringing the global to the local, that's important. And sending students out into the world. Dr. Avisanto in communication has students spend 4 hours at a so-called ethnic grocery store, and he has to watch what happens. The students have to watch what happens there, not necessarily for their papers, but just to see that these spaces provide so many other kinds of linkages. So it can be sending students out on a kind of scouting inquiry that doesn't necessarily have a formal structure, but they bring back their knowledge to the classroom. Yeah. Thank you.
Jennifer, can we go back 2 slides?
Yes.
Okay, right here you have a series of challenges.
Yes.
Now, could you, maybe not just now, but at some stage, prioritize what really would help develop community service or service learning? Take a couple of those things and say, look, if you have this, maybe we can make a huge amount of progress and put that forward. I mean, you may have an answer right now, because if you have a whole series of challenges, it's really difficult to do something. If you have a specific proposal, it may be a lot easier. And I'm speaking now wearing the hat of an administrator.
Yes. I do have a specific proposal, Dr. De Silva. When may I send that to you? I look to resources. I would point to resources, not always just financial resources, but what you had mentioned, it takes a lot of time, and faculty often don't get engaged in that initial community linkage. And so if the institution could carry the work of, say, 10 vested regular partnerships, and then there is a fair bit of labor investment in the contracts and the processing of those student experiences, and many universities have that centralized in a community engagement center. And so you have colleagues that are taking up that part of the labor that makes an enormous difference. And so building that into the institutional capacity, I think, would be the first step.
They say, well, the university takes care of that all. We have a wonderful volunteer department that take care of all the community, the links with, they go and they, negotiate whatever needs to be done, whatever can be done with the different organizations in the communities. They take care of the liability papers. They print the, paperwork that we need for this particular services. So on top of everything else that I do, then of course it makes the whole story very different. If I know that I have that support, I do still have to do extra work, of course. But if I have the support that will take care of major paperwork and some kind of links with different organizations in the community, that helps a lot.
And that institutional base can be important with quality measures as well, and making sure that students are performing in the field.
Thank you for coming in. I'm bringing this to the forefront at this school because there are a lot of schools out there. I know we went to Active Citizens Conference at William & Mary a few weeks ago. That's very awesome to actually go out and do service learning with the students and actually reflect on that. So that, and I would like to see ODU and other colleges here inside Southampton Road to actually get more involved in the service learning because of the issues and the things that go on right here in our areas, in our communities. And that's where I'm going towards the question. What examples do you see that that the students here can actually immerse themselves here in the community and then, take it on to another level that you think?
We've worked with writing projects in neighboring communities here. We've worked with a number of schools, and there are some benchmark institutions too. Virginia Commonwealth University is a Carnegie Scholar institution where they're vested in service learning, and so they have some models in terms of how to link the actual experience to particular themes. And one can sometimes develop a theme like borders or social justice, and then link number of courses across disciplines. So you could involve, natural sciences, social sciences, the arts, all under one theme. So, and then we do have a list of community organizations, and I think the investment is in the labor of maintaining those relations, which is a heavy investment. So we have some resources in terms of partnerships that have begun here. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. We at the Center for Learning and Teaching are excited to welcome you to the Provost Conversation Series. I just want to take a moment for a little commercial. In May 22nd and 3rd, we will be having our annual Summer Institute, and the theme this year is Teaching and Learning Connections. So that's exactly what we're talking about today, and I want you to, if you're curious, go to clt.odu.edu and take a look at our Summer Institute program. But for now, we just want to thank Jennifer Fish. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.